Good evening, everyone. My name is James Hannon. If you don't know me, I'm the Dean of the College of Education, Health, and Human Services, and it is my utmost pleasure to welcome you all to the first of two keynote addresses highlighting the 2019 Educator Summit at Kent State University titled May 4th, 1970, Then and Now, Voices for Change. Please remember to return tomorrow evening for a talk by Sarah Abu Rashed, student activist, poet, and artist, whose presentation will be followed by David Hassler, director of Kent State's Wick Poetry Center, who will lead guests in contributing to a community-created poem. In addition, I want you to remember that tonight's event will conclude with a reception in the ballroom balcony, so please join us there and engage in discussion after the talk. The Educator Summit is designed to prepare teachers to educate a new generation of students about the history and legacy of May 4th, 1970, and to use inquiry to make direct connections to contemporary issues and events. A major goal is to empower educators to support students in finding their voices and expressing those voices in a constructive and productive manner. We'd like to give a special thank you to the Martha Holden Jennings Foundation for their support of the summit, and I'd like to give a warm welcome to all of our teachers attending this first Educator Summit. It is now my pleasure to introduce the 13th president of Kent State University, Todd Dicon. A tireless advocate for student success, President Dicon has more than 30 years of experience in higher education leadership. His commitment to college affordability and access have resulted in nationally recognized initiatives to boost student retention, graduation rates, and academic achievement. President Dicon joined Kent State as provost in 2012 and has been at the forefront of expanding Kent State's international presence. He has led the charge to recruit and promote more diverse faculty and has helped the university attract world-renowned leaders in their fields of research and teaching. Before coming to Kent State, President Dicon served as Deputy Chancellor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He began his career at the University of Tennessee as a history professor. President Dicon's run 7 marathons, that's pretty impressive, and desperately wants to get back to his first love, riding motorcycles. Please join me in welcoming Kent State University President Todd Dicon.
Thank you, and thank you for that warm welcome. And I'll begin tonight with some simple but very heartfelt thank yous. And so I want to begin with Dean Hannon, the Dean of our College of Education and Human Services. So thank you, Dean. Annette Krakowski, our Director of our Kent State Research Center for Education Technology. Dr. Todd Hawley, our Associate Professor of Social Studies, Teacher Education. I want to thank all of you that helped to organize tonight's event, and in particular, Rod Flauhaus and LaShonda Taylor. But mostly, and I mean this in all sincerity, I want to thank all of you for attending this event. Tonight is the first of over 100 university events observing May 4, 1970 that will take place over the next 12 months. And this year of programming and these observances give us the powerful opportunity to remember the students whose lives were taken that day and to reflect on the impact of the shootings on family members and on survivors. This year of programming will give us the opportunity to probe for additional clarity and understanding of the events themselves and to draw on the lessons of this past to better understand and address the issues of today. And of course, the passage of these 50 years gives us the opportunity to examine our own lives, our own choices, and to ponder the impact of the decisions we have made on our lives today. The dictionary defines the word grace as, quote, simple elegance or courteous goodwill. In its form as a verb the dictionary defines grace as, quote, to do honor or credit to something or someone by one's presence. Furthermore, the dictionary defines persistence as, quote, firm continuance in course of action in spite of difficulty or opposition. Firm continuance in a course of action in spite of difficulty or opposition. Tonight's speaker embodies these two words and indeed combines them into what I would term graceful persistence. Dr. Tom Grace took a history exam on the morning of May 4, 1970. He then attended a political science class and then attended the rally where he was shot in the foot. Dr. Grace graduated from Kent State University in 1972. He went on to earn a master's in social work degree, and while working full-time as a union leader for 2 decades, earned in 2003 a doctorate of history. Since then, he has served as an adjunct professor of history at a variety of institutions in Western New York, most notably at SUNY Erie. Currently, Dr. Grace serves as a member of the 50th Commemoration Advisory Committee, and he is also the author of a very fine book, one that I enjoyed reading immensely, on the history of student activism at Kent State, entitled Kent State, Death and Dissent in the Long Sixties, and I noticed the book is for sale in the lobby, and I highly recommend it. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Grace.
Certainly the eyeglasses give my age away, don't they? Before I get started with my prepared remarks, is John and Kathy Cleary here? Are they here? Okay. Oh, yes. Thank you, John. I was trying to pick you up in the audience, and I appreciate you coming. Before I get started with my prepared remarks, I thought President Dicon made a very effective use of my last name. I owe all of that to my Irish forebears, County Kilkenny. I'd like to say just a couple of things about what the talk is going to be like before I go into it, and it's going to be about a half hour in length. It's not meant to be an overt political speech by any means. It's meant to be a scholarly address that particularly takes into account tonight's audience that includes somewhere between 30 and 40 educators who are going to be at a conference for the next day and a half. So it is going to require some rather close listening, and I'll ask your indulgence on that. But I would like to, before I begin the prepared remarks, I'd also like to make special mention of a gentleman who came up to me, who I haven't seen in a good long while, Dr. Richard Breedemeyer. Where's Dr. Breedemeyer seated? Dr. Breedemeyer, if you'd just stand up, please. Thank you, and thank you for doing that. I didn't know if Dr. Breedemeyer would recognize me with a tie on. If I wore a headband, he might have recognized me more readily. But he was an administrator here when I was a student radical in 71 and 72. I don't know if I've lost that much of my radicalism, but I'm no longer a student. And I certainly think I've gained some wisdom in the 50 years since I was, or nearly 50 years since I graduated from the campus here. So I wanted to say all that by way of introduction. And I'm going to be asking one other person to stand a second time once I've started my prepared remarks. In terms of my remarks this evening, let me begin by thanking President Todd Dicon for your very kind introduction. You honor me, President Dicon, and I really appreciate it. And knowing of the effort that goes into organizing these kinds of gatherings, I am deeply appreciative, too, for the planning done by Dr. Annette Kratkowski, Director of KSU's Research Center for Educational Technology. She did a superb job in helping to organize this conference. Please, thank you. I am grateful as well to Professor Todd Hawley and others for helping me to access high school textbooks for my review. And it is a privilege to be here at my alma mater where I first studied history and, quite unintentionally, made a bit of it too. One whose historical role was equally unplanned is here tonight with his wife, as I just verified. Let us all thank John and Kathy Cleary for joining us all the way from Pittsburgh. And I asked the two of them to stand. I know they don't want to do that, but I'm going to ask them to do it again. John, for those of you that don't know, was on the cover of Life magazine in the week after the shootings, lying unconscious from his wound. Tonight, I'll offer thoughts about making anniversaries of the distant past relevant in an era of contested facts, move next to the teaching of the 60s, and then discuss my book, Kent State, Death and Dissent in the Long Sixties, as the content, I hope, may be of some educational value. 7 years ago, the President declared a remembrance of the Vietnam War that will last until 2025. Now, halfway through this longer observance of the war, those here tonight, as President Dicon just mentioned, are helping to herald a year-long commemoration of the day when 4 students lost their lives in a protest over the expansion of that war into Cambodia. It is said that history is a dialogue between past and present. Those charged with planning programs making this past are aware of the challenge in making the remembrance as relevant as possible to the students now attending the university or the incoming freshmen. Educators at this conference are all familiar with teens that cannot bring to mind a time without cell phones or an era without personal computers, cable, television, and video games, much less the 1960s, an era so seemingly distant from their lives. The parallels between the sharp divisions of that decade and the current discord of the Make America Great Again era are obvious to many of us with gray hair. These similarities are often lost on those without historical memories of those times. How to reconstruct the divisive past during the year-long observance of the shootings is one test that we face. The same period of unrest that at once strengthened freedom of expression has also reinforced America's current political divisions. Progress seldom goes uncontested. Aware of the significance of the day that will be marked next year, we might reflect for a moment on another moment in time, the 70th anniversary of the publication of George Orwell's 1984, a book that I trust many of you are familiar with. The book continues as a bestseller in political fiction. Many discover 1984 on their own. Those assigned the novel in school get to consider whether today's nation resembles less fiction than fact. Those ignorant of the warnings the book contains, mainly of servility to manipulative authority, may contest the existence of factual knowledge. They are convinced that they are entitled to their own facts, or what presidential counselor Kellyanne Conway termed alternative facts. This Orwellian era is one where the press is regarded, quote unquote, as an enemy of the people, and unwelcome news is considered fake. Historians and many others who value veracity continue to believe that John Adams had it right when he offered that facts are stubborn things. Whatever we make of all this, those charged with fostering the growth of rational knowledge and critical thinking among students know the pressures of navigating the classroom within this contentious world. It is a world that also includes school board pressures, underfunded education, and textbook meddlers. In his examination of history standards in education, teacher and historian Fritz Fischer takes the title of his book, The Memory Hole, from Orwell's 1984 novel. Focusing most of his book on the misuse of history by those he calls, quote unquote, right-wing anti-historians, Fischer also recognizes that, quote unquote, left-wing anti-historians can also mishandle the past. How all of this figures in the teaching of the Vietnam War and the opposition to the conflict that took the lives of students here at Kent State and 2 others in Jackson, Mississippi, is a matter I will get to shortly. But let us spend a little more time with Fritz Fischer and the standards that he believes will safeguard educational methods and content from zealots on the right and purists on the left. Beyond the need to cultivate student comprehension skills that all teachers seek to reinforce, Fritz Fischer's first lesson of education will resonate with instructors who cherish inquiry. Quote unquote, history is about questions, he asserts, while discussing as well the guidelines governing the evaluation of evidence. Flowing from the first, Fisher's second requirement of educators is to examine, quote unquote, multiple perspectives when assembling a chronology and discussing cause and effect. Aware that each generation looks at the past anew, Fischer recognizes that history, social studies educators will, quote, also ask new questions or ask the old questions in new ways. By the way, someday those who ask questions about Kent State will go beyond those that threaten to go stale, such as who to blame for the deaths on May 4th. Important though the question remains, we need to make new inquiries of the still contentious history of Kent State. If Fisher's rules seem rudimentary to some, at least books like 1984 and Fisher's book, The Memory Hole, serve current needs or as a needed refresher. I recommend that educators read The Memory Hole. That said, you will find the book less helpful in dealing with the Vietnam War and the campus we were on tonight where that war came home. A book cannot cover everything. In his discussion of the misuse of history, Fisher used examples other than Vietnam and Kent State. For these 2 subjects, we'll examine a series of textbooks used in America's schools, including one co-authored by Fritz Fischer, before turning briefly to the subject of document-based teaching, and then I'll offer some thoughts on my own book. For this talk, I reviewed 8 textbooks used in 3 states, including Ohio. Those teaching with a text will find some of the surveys to be sophisticated in their coverage of the Cold War, Vietnam, and its linkage of Cambodia and the Kent State killings. One multi-authored text dedicates 35 pages to the conflict, wartime dissent, and the legacies of Vietnam, with mention of both the Kent and Jackson State killings and the inclusion of John Filo's iconic photo of Marianne Vecchio kneeling over the lifeless body of Jeffrey Miller. The same classroom text, it's entitled The American Vision, provides cause and effect questions asking how President Nixon's invasion of Cambodia led to the Kent State shootings. Problematically, the authors also assert that on May 4th, 1970, the National Guard received no order to fire. I'll say more on this in a moment. Errors creep into some other textbooks. Kent State was not the first place where students died at the hands of uniformed authorities. Sadly, killings on 4 other campuses preceded those at Kent State. 9 students were wounded by National Guard gunfire, not 11, as indicated in the text America's History. Nor did state guardsmen in Mississippi storm a female dormitory at Jackson State. More than 100 rounds of police fire in Jackson proved bad enough and contributed to a higher number of wounded there than the casualty count at Kent State's. The books used in Roosevelt's Theodore Roosevelt High School deserve special mention. The AP review text assigned there provides little space to Vietnam and but a sentence to the killings at Kent and Jackson State. The principal text used at Roosevelt High School, however, America Through the Lens, also by Fritz Fisher and several others, blends primary sources, photos, and an eye-catching diagram of the Viet Cong tunnel structures used so effectively against U.S. forces and their South Vietnamese allies. Philo's prize-winning photo consumes an entire page, while the book gives a full paragraph to the killings here and at Jackson State. I like, too, the quote at the beginning of the book's section on the war from veteran and then presidential aspirant Senator John Kerry. I saw courage both in the Vietnam War and in the struggle to stop it, he said. To keep from becoming immersed in the methods of writing history and teaching, I'll avoid a further textbook review. All of the references that I have made can be found in the notes for this talk, and the talk will be posted online. I would like to touch lightly on document-based instruction. Earlier, I mentioned the controversial order to fire, heard on an audio tape of the shootings that was rediscovered by librarian and Kent State casualty Alan Canfora in 2007. For years, the central question has been, why did the guard fire? One textbook I examined attributes the shootings to quote-unquote jumpy guardsmen, while another refers to them as quote-unquote panicky. Teachers may find the reliability of the evidence for the order to fire given to the guardsmen and the debate that it has engendered a worthy classroom project. The endnotes for my own talk provide a partial evidentiary trail of the audio tape of the shootings. The conclusion to the full story, at least to date, ended in April 2012 with a disappointing, and in my mind, at least to my mind, and craven response by then Assistant U.S. Attorney General Thomas Perez. In the judgment of some, his office failed to carefully examine the audio taped evidence. He has since literally walked away from any further discussion of it. More broadly, for those teaching Kent State without a text, there are oral testimonies, such as those comprising the ever-growing May 4th oral history collection at Kent State. And if you're not acquainted with special collections, you should be. It's an altogether splendid place, and I could not have researched my book without it. The oral histories are rich document sources. Like all evidence, they require careful use and contextualization. The interviews were conducted long after the killings and asked generally open-ended questions rather than queries directed by the interviewers. The anonymous interviews in the collection require special scrutiny. For an example of how to use oral testimony properly, teachers may want to consult the book Above the Shots by Craig Simpson and Gregory Wilson. Other suggested primary sources will be found once again in the endnotes for this talk this evening. With the remainder of my time, I'll focus on the book and how teachers might find value in it as a reference, and others who are not educators as a detailed window on the past. For it is a microhistory that examines the student movement on the Kent campus within a state, national, and international context. Some background is in order about the events that set in motion the killings by the Ohio National Guard. In the spring of 1970, America was in its 16th month of Richard Nixon's presidency. The United States was in the 6th year of full-scale military involvement in Vietnam. Despite having previously decreased the level of American involvement there, Nixon startled a nationwide television audience the evening of April 30th, 1970, with an announcement that United States troops were entering the territory of Vietnam's neighbor, Cambodia. College campuses exploded with fury. At Kent State, 3 nights of protests and mayhem ensued, with students breaking windows in downtown Kent and setting flame to the old military-style barracks that housed the campus Army Reserve Officer Training Center. Over 1,200 Ohio National Guardsmen were ordered to the campus by Ohio Governor James Rhodes to quell the disorders. Rhodes was then locked in a tight race to determine the winner of the Republican primary. The primary was on May 5th, and used the events to portray himself as the disciple of law and order. On May 4th, 1970, after dispersing 500 to 1,000 protesters with a much larger crowd of onlookers who became mixed with the demonstrators, guardsmen suddenly opened fire on the ragged student ranks, killing 4 and wounding 9. The war had come home. My purpose in reconstructing this history was to uncover the roots of Kent's student movement, along with chronicling the aftermath of the killings. A term used in the book's title, The Long Sixties, refers to a tumultuous era that does not fit neatly into a chronological decade. I reasoned that the roots of 60s dissent could be located in the 1950s and as far back as the Great Depression. Here in Ohio, the year 1958 proved especially significant. Some students, influenced by the opinions of their parents, became involved in a successful campaign waged by Ohio labor against a Republican-backed right-to-work amendment. They were trying to change the Ohio Constitution to make Ohio a right-to-work state, which would have undercut the unions in the state. With the political upheaval of 1958 framing the beginning of the book, the chronicle concludes with the 1973 Paris Peace Accords that produced the temporary armistice in Vietnam. And I should add parenthetically that Ohio workers voted out of office that year every Republican that was on the ballot. On the 30th anniversary of the killings, a Cleveland Press reporter who had been at Kent State in 1970 wrote a retrospective piece recalling that moment in time. So he's writing this 30 years later, the year 2000. He revisited the details of the day, but also asked questions. Again, questions is how we get at history, including some that puzzled thinkers decades later. The reporter asked rhetorically, why Kent? Why this middle-of-the-road state school in the middle of America? History is about questions. Where did Kent students come from in the long 60s? What do we know about their family origins and their formative politics? Was there a movement on the campus for labor and then civil rights, or did student activity amount to no more than a panty raid in 1958, as the New York Times wrongly reported? So the first draft of history was incorrect, wasn't it? What about the Ohio National Guard sent to the campus to subdue the anti-war disturbances in 1970? Were they, as one historian incorrectly surmised, quote, by social background not so very different from the students they had come to police, end of quote. And lastly, did the killings silence dissent at Kent State, as a former American president and so many historians mistakenly believe? Seeking answers to these questions in my dissertation, I used numeric and personal methods of research, or quantitative and qualitative methods. The first involved determining student hometowns. Were the students here, as Arthur Schlesinger Jr., one of the 20th century's most renowned historians, dubiously inferred, quote, all from small towns or off the farm, square, unradical, and Midwest American? That was his impression of the students after visiting here. Or were they, just as often, urban, progressive, and blue collar? To determine some of this, I examined the names of 5,000 students. It was the most tedious exercise of my entire life. in university directories at 5-year intervals from 1955 to 1965 in order to determine their communities of origin. Without getting immersed in the details, you're already getting a lot of details, the percentage of urban youth at KSU ranged over the period, this is from 55 to 65, from a high of 50% down to 29%. Yet in raw numbers, there were more students from urban areas at Kent State in 1965 than there had been 10 years earlier. Since hometown and Bureau of Labor Statistics revealed where students lived and the degree of industrialization of their communities, but not the social status of particular families, I personally interviewed dozens of Kent activists to determine the occupations of their parents. In other words, what kind of homes did these kids grow up in? Located near the geographic center of Ohio's Western Reserve, Kent and Portage County remained small town and rural in the late 1950s. The area surrounding it, however, had by then become one of the most industrialized in the nation. By 1955, half of Kent's students were from the industrial centers: Cleveland, Lorain, Akron, Barberton, Canton, Massillon, and Youngstown, Warren. Even with the beginnings of deindustrialization, a third of Kent's students in the late 1960s continued to hail from these manufacturing areas, giving the university an increasingly working-class student character. I concentrated on activists from these urban areas because such an approach revealed a measure of political continuity between the generations. It showed how a culture of unionism and New Deal beliefs helped to shape the embryonic politics of young people raised in blue-collar households. Some historians argue that class often informs how people think and act, and how social class frequently defines life choices and opportunities. Through the looking glass of economic class, I explored how Kent's activist students could be understood as voices for change, rather than as victims or as lawbreakers, as liberals and conservatives have generally framed the story. Therefore, I deduced the story of Kent's protest movement could be best understood through a lens of class and urban small-town strains that influenced the growth of the campus struggle. At the beginning of the 1960s, 18,000 people populated the city of Kent. They lived in an area surrounded by some of the most industrialized cities in America. 30 miles to the north stands the once mighty metropolis of Cleveland, home to many Kent students, and where, in 1960, better than 4 of every 10 workers labored in industry. So this didn't count the people who picked up the garbage or drove the school buses or worked as clerks in stores. These were people that worked in heavy industry. In Akron, the percentage was slightly higher. Barberton, tops in the state, had a whopping 63% of its workers employed in industrial production. The student whose photo adorns the cover of several books, including my own, is a Barberton native, and in 1970, the son of a UAW local vice president. Historians such as Arthur Schlesinger misread the character of the student body. Cleveland had many unions, as well as a strong civil rights movement, to go with the presence of peace and old left political groups. Together with a large Jewish enclave on the city's east side, where Allison Krauss was born, these factors created a robust democratic political culture, which had an enormous effect on the city's students who attended Kent State. Kent's geographic position and the development of the nation's interstate highway system also affected the campus movement, especially after 1965, when the thoroughfares gave out-of-state students, such as yours truly, a means to travel here. Out-of-staters began to make up an increasingly larger percent of the student body. I think it was 15% by 1970, and an even greater percentage of its activists. I'll just pause and remind you that 2 of the 4 people that were killed on May 4th were from either Pittsburgh or Long Island. Those who shaped Kent's Long Sixties were formed by a variety of familial influences: unionism and New Deal politics, belief in racial equality, a Catholic social gospel, Christian existentialism, secular Jewish radicalism, the old left, and paradoxically, Cold War liberalism. I'll say more on this in a moment. Whatever their political inheritances, Kent's activists questioned the limits of liberalism. In doing so, they grew increasingly alienated from the dominant social order. Black and working class Ohioans and out-of-staters who attended Kent State in the 1960s were often a breed apart and had an uneasy relationship with Kent's small-town Protestant and Republican culture. From the outset of Kent's decade of dissent, military veterans also played a role in the protest. This was true at the beginning, as well as the end of the Long Sixties, when increasing numbers of Vietnam veterans returned to protest a war they had just fought. By 1970, approximately 1 out of every 10 KSU students, or male students, was a veteran or member of the reserves. What do we know of Kent's early student movement? You recall earlier that the Times said that nothing ever happened at Kent State from 1958 to 1970 except the panty raid. So what do we know about this early student movement? Well, the protests at the beginning of the 1960s focused on supporting Southern civil rights sit-ins, integrating public accommodations, and eliminating racial segregation in off-student housing. A few Kent students went south, including one who joined the Freedom Riders in 1961, a group that sought to integrate the interstate bus system and included John Lewis, now a congressman. Some of you will remember that he gave a wonderful speech here on the campus not long ago. As students carved out political space for their right to protest, the campus was witness to free speech battles over speaker choice, as well as for the freedom of assembly and organization. The right to form a student chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality, one would think that that would have been an agreeable enough proposition, became the subject of a bitter campus debate, as did the first protest of the Vietnam War. Peace activism grew steadily, but slowly at Kent State. Much of the pioneering anti-war cohort came from socialist families. Nonetheless, the majority of Kent's working class students were from families that had embraced Cold War liberalism. This belief system involved varying degrees of support for racial tolerance, a dedication to labor rights that was seen in the vote in 1958 that I referred to earlier, and also having a positive view of government. Today, everybody hates government, or seemingly so. But back then, people saw that it could be a very positive instrument of change. But this Cold War liberalism also believed in the containment of communism. So it was only after the convulsions that rocked the 1968 Democratic National Convention, where hundreds were beaten by the Chicago police, some savagely, did many Kent students come to embrace anti-war radicalism. A confrontational local chapter of the Kent Students for Democratic Society emerged after the Chicago protest and formed a short-lived alliance with the Black United Students at the university in November 1968. A struggle ensued with black and white allies on one side and their administration foes on the other, which climaxed in the spring of 1969 with arrests and suspensions of 80 activists, the banning of the SDS chapter, and the investigation of the radical group by the United States House of Representatives Internal Security Committee. It was one of 2 chapters in the entire country that was investigated by the Internal Security Committee. In the 1950s, this committee was known as the House on Un-American Activities. The crackdown caused a larger furor. As many as 5,000 students demonstrated against the methods used by the university to assail the radicals. When school resumed in the fall of 1969 after the famous Woodstock Music Festival, we're going to mark the 50th anniversary of that in about 2 weeks, Kent was a different campus. Increasing numbers of students were demonstrating against the war. members of Greek fraternities that had condemned protest in the spring of 1969 reversed course and embraced anti-war activism, as did a growing number of athletes. By mid-April 1970, anti-war clashes in Cleveland, in which scores of Kent's students participated, proved to be a dress rehearsal for the wave of demonstrations on a nearby yet unseen horizon. In examining the use of forceful tactics by activists who fought back against counter-protesters in 1969 and who, in 1970, set fire to the campus ROTC building in response to the Cambodian invasion, it is much harder to determine if such actions were influenced by class background. What is clearly evident is the use of deadly force by armed authorities in the 1960s was confined entirely to public universities, 8 campuses in as many states. Counting Kent, a total of 16 students were slain, half of them African American. By and large, the dead were blue collar and students at historically black colleges. It is equally tricky trying to determine why a movement persisted at Kent State in the face of deadly force. Writers and at least one president, those who were here for Bob Woodward's talk in May, remember what Bob Woodward had to say about President Nixon. Writers and at least one president contended that the killings at Kent State did what they were intended to do, silence dissent. Even a historian who did his graduate work at Kent State claimed, quote, "The collective judgment of ex-activists, journalists, government officials, and historians has been remarkably consistent. The deaths at Kent State marked the end of the mass youth protest," end of quote. Such opinions, widely shared until recently, may or may not have been true of the nation at large, but at Kent State, they are directly contradicted by what historians most value, evidence and facts, which again are stubborn things. The length of the talk precludes an examination of the companies of the National Guard that fired the fatal rounds, although we should understand that the guardsmen involved in the shootings were trained, experienced, older than those they killed, and in most cases, lacking in remorse. Nor do I have time to discuss the complicated backlash that the killings generated against those on the Kent campus and students more generally. Those wanting more may want to consult the book or raise questions during the Q&A. Professor Hawley is going to be handling that portion of the program. As I near the end of the talk, what does this new look at Kent State reveal? We discover a campus populated not with well-born students, and by 1970, increasingly of Vietnam veterans, dozens of whom were fired upon by the National Guard. We have all heard stories of veterans being spit upon by spoiled protesters. Whatever the merit of such tales, in 1970, the Guardsmen spit lethal gunfire at student veterans. This led one friend of mine to say that he came closer to dying on this campus than he ever did in Vietnam. Kent State is a place where the children of blue-collar workers challenged racial discrimination, struggled for free speech, organization, and assembly, and rose against a war that claimed the lives of thousands of Ohioans, most of them working class. The killings did not silence the voices of change. Instead, repression provoked more dissent. Those who survived have labored for a half-century to ensure that the dead were remembered as they are today, with historical signage, campus memorials, a restoration of the historic scene, thanks to the actions of our new president, and at the May 4th Visitor Center and in gatherings such as this. Finally, what of current students at Kent State inheriting this 50-year-old past? When I started Kent State in the fall of 1968, it had been 50 years since the end of World War I, and that was very, very distant in my life. Historian Jeremy Varon gives us a sobering answer to this question, writing, quote, that droves of Americans, younger Americans, neither situate their own lives in relation to the 60s or have any special curiosity about its silent shaping of their world. End of quote. At the same time, he recognizes that such nonchalance does not diminish the usable past and or the importance of democratic rights. For, as Jeremy Varon asserts, history and commemorations remind us of who, quote, we are as a nation and as a people, end of quote. The sharp divisions of 21st century America tell us why Kent State 1970 is still current and will likely remain until, as Varon hopes, quote, the country arrives at a truly new horizon, end of quote. Varon's mixture of realism and tempered confidence mines the past on behalf of aspirational goals. His words call to mind Martin Luther King's last speech in Memphis. In King's famous mountaintop address, the soon-to-be martyred civil rights leader demanded enforcement of constitutional rights and protections for the nation's most deprived citizens. King called for the country to rid itself of hypocrisy. Quote, this is from King's speech, all we say to America is, be true to what you said on paper. He said that on the last night of his life. Let us have faith that someday most Americans, young and old, will rise to King's challenge and heed the voices of change while we draw strength and inspiration from the day in history that will mark next year. And let us find continued virtue in the nation's founding creeds. Those honored beliefs, redefined by the 1960s, should never go out of date. Thank you for your kind attention.
Hi, my name's Jim Mueller. I'm on the 50th Programming Committee for, for May 4th. Tom, former Ohio Governor John Gilligan told me once that he was all set to have a very pro-student reaction to the events of May 4th, 1970, and that when the situation ended up in the federal courts, he felt that tied his hands. Do you think that's historically accurate on his part?
Now, what year are you referring to, Jim?
Well, I talked to him about a couple years before.
No. I mean,
1971, 72, because he was elected in 1970, took office in 71. He didn't, he just said that he felt it had been a great injustice, but then when all of the things got into the federal court, so to speak, he just felt that kind of tied his hands as far as the state being proactive in seeking justice.
It's hard for me to comment on that. I don't think it would have been to his political advantage to have gotten involved in that. He came close to ordering out the National Guard here in 1971 and then backed off on that. I was reminded of that today when I was looking at some back issues of the Record Courier over at the library in Ravenna. So, I thought highly of Governor Gilligan, but that may have been a dodge on his part. But it's hard. That's just an opinion, and it's not a terribly informed one. But I think I can say with some confidence that it would not have been to his political advantage to have done so, I don't think.
All right, other questions?
Yes, good evening, Tom. Tim Simandl here, leader of the College of Architecture, senior guest student. You have mentioned in your excellent talk this evening the very profound and significant formative influence that the New Deal exercised in the background formative years of many of the students coming of age here on campus. What one aspect, or really important aspects of the New Deal, would you believe had the most lasting influence on the students here?
Well, it was influential in the sense that they received that knowledge and those opinions from their parents, rather than them having a direct memory of it. And I think the main benefit to that was that it provided the opportunity for their mothers or their fathers, and in some cases their mothers, to labor in a unionized industry, which increased their purchasing power and enabled them to set aside, for some of the students at any rate, enough money so their children could go to college. Because for the most part, men, and in some cases women, who worked in the factories, particularly in heavy industry, they did not necessarily want their children to go into that line of work. As it turns out, with deindustrialization, it was probably a good thing that they didn't, because they would have been going into jobs and occupations that they would have lost and then been unemployed. In fact, I have any number of friends that happened to. But I think that in terms of their economic situation, that was the biggest legacy of it. But it also imbued in the students a progressive outlook that marked them as being different from people who grew up being hostile to President Roosevelt and the New Deal. And of course, there were many, many people like that in Ohio too. I used to be able to tell someone's politics at Kent State almost by their last name and by learning a little bit about how long their parents had lived in this state. You know, if they lived in a city and they were first or second generation and they had an ethnic last name, chances are they were a Democrat. And if they if they grew up in a rural county and had an English or German surname and their lineage went back to the 19th century in Ohio, and they were not from southern Ohio, chances are they were a Republican. And the activist cohort in Kent came, as I hoped I was able to underscore in the talk, very much from these cities, and to a lesser extent from out-of-state students.
Thank you.
I mean, it was amazing to me when I would go through the book and I would see the identity of the kids who gravitated towards SDS, or the Black United Students, and saw where they came from. And then their right-wing critics, they were from all these small towns. Even today, when I was, I'm going to be presenting a paper here in October on the Vietnam veterans against the war. And in late April of 1972, they conducted a very effective guerrilla theater. And for those of you that don't know what guerrilla theater is, it's where a number of people are in on a public display of theater, but not everyone else is aware of what is taking place. So they were blaring the sounds of a B-52 raid, and then students took this fake blood and they threw it on themselves and dropped dead in front of the student union. And then 10 men who were members of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War had plastic M16s rather, and went through and were proceeding to pretend that they were bayoneting or shooting the people who had survived the B-52 strike. And as you might imagine, the students who weren't in on this is 2 years after the shootings, they were completely shocked that this was taking place. And most of them were more shocked than angered, but the one person who seemed to object to it the most was, sure enough, from some little town in Ohio. And he was arguing with Ken Johnson, who came from a socialist family, who was a Vietnam veteran against the war, and came from an urban area. So those kind of background issues were very important in terms of determining who became an activist, and just as importantly, who didn't.
All right, thank you so much for coming. My name is Jason Cohen over here.
Oh, yes, okay.
Hi. I'm a student here. I'm president of Alpha Epsilon Pi on campus. And my question is, so being at the protests,
Was that Jim Russell's?
Jim Russell's?
Okay,
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay, all right. He was wounded on May 4th, and he was in a fraternity.
Okay, I'll look into that. So being at the protests right before the shooting and at the shooting, what were they like? How safe or unsafe were they? Like, was the National Guard actually necessary to be sent there and stuff like that?
Well, the National Guard were mobilized in Ohio more than any other state. So that's what accounts for their experience. They were not wet behind the ears. There are some who feel that if the highway patrol had been, and there were elements of the Ohio Highway Patrol here on the campus, but if they had been utilized more fully, particularly on May 4th, 1970, that the killings would not have occurred. But certainly when you're having tear gas fired, windows broken, a building burned down, you were asking about how safe. I mean, those, you can get hurt, certainly, in those kind of situations. The firemen came and tried to douse the flames. Students grabbed their fire hoses and pulled them away. The students who had knives with them cut the fire hoses up. I think I referred to it in my talk as mayhem, and that I don't think that was too strong of a word. But what I try to do in the book was to describe what took place rather than making a judgment about it. What the students were trying to do was stop the war. Mm-hmm. Whether they used the right methods or the wrong methods, that's for all of you to determine. What I did was describe what took place.
Thank you.
Even though I was there and I was present for some of those things that were happening, but I wasn't present for all of it. I had a dinner this evening. I was talking with the president of the university that actually the night before, I was actually studying for a history exam that I had the morning of May 4th. So I was living in the moment in terms of trying to stop the war, but I also had an eye towards the future. And none of us, I don't think, or very few of us at any rate, came here to protest the war in Vietnam. I certainly didn't. I came here to study history and political science, and that's what I did.
Thank you so much.
I know we have a question back here, kind of in the middle. Yes, ma'am. And we have a microphone coming.
Thank you. My name is Maxine, and my question has to do with, I'm curious about the mix of the protesters on the campus that day, what the makeup was. Were there Black United students? Were there SDS students? Were there Weathermen? And how much disagreement was there regarding what moves to make next, how to proceed, what to do?
Well, let me, thank you for coming, Maxie. And let me answer the last question first. These protests that erupted at Kent, at least the ones in the evening of May 1st, which was Friday, and on May 2nd, which was a Saturday, as well as the evening of May 3rd, they were largely spontaneous. There wasn't any organization that was conducting the protest. So it was really almost impossible to give it direction. There were some students that met on the morning of May 4th to see if they might use their influence to either help shape the direction of the protest that day, which everyone knew was coming, because it had been called on May 1st, without the knowledge that all these other things were going to happen in the meantime, or to try to stop the rally, because they were concerned that it might be very dangerous. But they ultimately decided that they didn't have the standing with the students or enough ties to them to get the students to listen, and how would they gain access to them? Would they start just walking around to different classrooms, or would they try to give a talk on May 4th? There was a student who's today a professor of Chinese history at New Mexico State. The man's name is Ken Hammond, who had been an SDS leader. And he was in the crowd on May 4th, and he stood on the victory bell, the brick and mortar casement that holds the bill in place, or the victory bell in place. And he stood up and said, "Is it the feeling of this group that there should be a strike on this campus?" And then the students started to chant, "Strike, strike, strike, strike." And that was as far as anyone went, as far as I know, over that 4-day period in terms of the evening protest to help shape or give direction to what was taking place. And that very short, if one could call a 10 or 11 word statement a speech, that wound up getting him indicted. He was one of the Kent 25. In terms of the people participating, there were some people that were out there protesting every single night, the 3 nights, and then were there on May 4th. There were other people that participated for a day or two, and then they saw the National Guard come into town. They said, "I'm getting out of here," and they left the campus. Many of the students that were there on May 4th had been away for the entire weekend. I'm sure that Kent is the same kind of campus now as it was then. A lot of students come from Northeast Ohio. They live close enough to drive home for the weekend. They go home to see their parents, get their laundry done, see their boyfriend or their girlfriend, and then come back on Sunday evening. So a lot of students came back on Sunday evening knowing what had taken place. They saw it on television, but seeing it on television and coming back and finding an armored personnel carrier at one of the principal intersections in the town, and maybe a National Guardsman with a bayonet affixed to his rifle standing outside of your dormitory, that's fairly shocking. Most of the African American students had seen it up in Cleveland and in Akron. The Guard units had been deployed in both of those cities, from '66 onwards, so that was not a shock to them. But there were only about 600 or 700 African American students on the campus. The white students never seen anything like that before, so it was very shocking to them. So I don't think that's a complete answer to your question, but it answers in as full a way as I can without going on and on and on.
All right, and I think we have only time for one more question in the back.
How about 2?
Well, you're in charge.
Hello.
So 2 more questions.
My name's Steve Bauer.
Because we haven't heard it from any educators either, I don't think.
Oh, yeah. My name's Steve Bauer, and I'm kind of a follow-on from that last question. I grew up here. I was here that day. I was a junior at Kent Roosevelt High School. I was there with the fixed bayonets and coming at us. Then we left when the tear gas came. But I want to ask you, I didn't recall, now it's a long time ago, and then I got drafted right after that. But I didn't see mayhem as far as the students or us throwing a lot of stuff back at them.
You're talking about on May 4th.
Yeah,
Okay.
May 4th on the Victory Bell.
Right.
We were there.
Yeah.
And I didn't sense really mayhem as far as the students throwing stuff back.
Well, there was some of that, and of course I was referring more to what took place on the preceding 3 nights rather than. I don't think it was a riotous situation on May 4th.
Right.
That was created when the National Guard started throwing tear gas into the crowd.
Right.
And you had a very different element of students that were there on May 4th than you did on the previous evenings. The people who were there on May 4th were almost entirely students.
Right.
Whereas downtown, maybe half the crowd was non-students. All the people who were arrested on the evening of May 4th gave addresses, for the most part, from outside of Kent. They weren't here as necessarily as outside agitators. I mean, there was a very lively music scene in Kent, Ohio. And, you came here to listen to the James Gang on Friday night. Right. People would come up here from Canton and all kinds of places. Kent was where it was at, and a lot of people were just kind of caught up in things and wound up getting arrested. There there's a term that was used a lot in the early 1970s, outside agitators. It's kind of hard to determine what an outside agitator is. Is an outside agitator someone who was not a student at Kent State, or was an outside agitator a person who went here in the fall of 1968, went for 1 quarter and then got a job, and then stayed on in the Kent area and considered himself a part of the Kent community, but didn't go to school here any longer. So it's kind of, we have to almost get into what we mean by our terms. But clearly what took place up until the tear gas was fired on May 4th, 1970, you're absolutely correct. It was not a riotous situation. At least in my judgment.
Yeah,
the Portage County grand jury felt differently, of course,
Yes.
and they indicted 24 students and young people and 1 professor. And most of those charges stemmed from May 4th.
Thank you.
All right, and as much as I hate to do this, I'm going to have to bring the questions to a close.
Oh, weren't you going to let one more?
Unfortunately, we
Okay.
don't have time.
Okay,
So if you'd
that's
like
right.
to
We have-
talk to
we
me
have a
about
recep-
it.
we have a reception.
Yeah, we have a reception afterwards that I'm now inviting all of you to. And I hope that you will come. First, how about another round of applause for Dr. Tom Grace?
Thank you. And by the way, those people who didn't get a chance to ask a question, please come to the reception and approach me upstairs. And those of you that were too shy to ask a question, I'd ask you to come up to me as well. I'm really looking forward to meeting some of the educators that were here. Maybe this was too new to you to ask a question, but I hope some of what you're going to learn over the next couple of days will certainly spawn new inquiry. And thank you again for your very kind attention. You were a very nice audience, and I appreciate your attention very much. Thank you.
All right, I would like to invite everybody to our reception. I'd like to remind you that we have another keynote speaker tomorrow evening at 6:30. We hope that we'll see you then. Thank you. Have a nice evening.